The following review may contain spoilers. One thing that stood out immediately to me was the excellent film score. It used a lot of jazz, but then had this other unusual stuff with vocals, which I found out after the film was Radiohead's Tom York. I read that Edward Norton wanted to mix jazz and Radiohead and have an element of dissonance to match the main character's own dissonance as he is dealing with Tourette's. I thought this was an original, interesting, and effective choice for the score. Great idea to have a big actor like Bruce Willis play a character that dies early on in the film. I feel like we've seen this before. Maybe I'm thinking of Janet Leigh in Psycho, where a famous actor dies early. It really works here because Bruce Willis is the boss of the guys who work at the private investigation firm, Edward Norton's boss, and he's mentioned throughout the rest of the movie constantly. So to have someone with as big of a screen presence as Bruce Willis helps the storytelling as he casts a large shadow over the rest of the film. And although he only has a couple of scenes, Michael Kenneth Williams shines as a jazz musician, and Edward Norton is terrific as the main character, Lionel. This character has Tourette's and Edward Norton really pulls it off. I don't know if all of the lines he blurts out due to his condition were scripted, but they feel so natural, like they're coming straight from the subconscious. It never feels over the top at all. More on this later in the review. There are several scenes in the film that seem to have way too many setups and an unnecessarily fast editing pace. This is on display in the very first scene where Bruce Willis is talking to Norton and Ethan Suplee while they're sitting in a car. I thought it would be a bad sign for the rest of the film, but director Edward Norton seems to dial it back for most of the rest of the film. If you have too many setups, you lose some of the language of cinema, the visual poetry. Scenes just end up feeling more jumbled, and it doesn't seem like pacing is worth that result. Although Alec Baldwin is a great actor, I think he was miscast in the role he plays here. We've seen Alec Baldwin do this kind of government bureaucrat role, and then also some of the dialogue involving this megalomaniac makes you think of his Trump impression on SNL. I think Norton should have cast someone who maybe didn't play this kind of villainous bureaucrat before to give us a fresh take on it. And the female lead, Gugu Mbatha-Raw, just did not give a convincing performance. Something about both her appearance and acting style reminded me of Kerry Washington. Both of them tend to resort to what feels like face making at times, and there's not a lot of depth to the performance, and this character really needed a lot of layers as she's dealing with an uncle who just got murdered and finding out that her father is basically her arch nemesis. Mbatha-Raw just conveys none of these layers of sadness and complex emotions. On a minor note, some of the scenes look like they're done on studio sets and not locations. I mean, perhaps they're on studio sets, but usually movies and TV shows make it look much more realistic. Like when they're in Edward Norton's private investigation office, everything just looks so pristine. I think it had something to do with the mix of the cinematography and production design, but it just looked a little fake. It didn't look like a place where people were working there for a long period of time. Perhaps this was some kind of intentional stylistic choice, but it's a confusing one. My final rating for Motherless Brooklyn is 3 stars. As of the making of this video, the Rotten Tomatoes percentage for Motherless Brooklyn is 63%, which is a little bit low for this solid film. Here's an additional section, stuff I'd like to talk about that don't fall into the good or the bad. Since this channel is a post-movie watching analysis, and what I often do after movies is look at Rotten Tomatoes and read some of the critics' reviews, I'd like to take a section of this video to talk about some of those critics' points. First off, there were a lot of Chinatown comparisons. A quick Google search shows that Edward Norton did use Chinatown as an inspiration for this film. They're both neo-noirs. They both involve government bureaucrats abusing the system to make themselves rich. and they both have a mystery about who a female character's father is. But in terms of pacing and rhythm, they are different. They're stylistically different. Chinatown tends to let the camera just sit there and have the actor shine, which of course is a great idea when you have someone as exciting to watch as Jack Nicholson. But as I mentioned before, Motherless Brooklyn seems to have moments where the cutting is very fast for no reason. Norton seemed to have been inspired by the story elements of Chinatown, but not necessarily the filmmaking style. This film was at 63% on Rotten Tomatoes, and the negative reviews were surprisingly harsh. Some critics refer to it as a vanity project for Edward Norton. From what I think that term alludes to, I would disagree with that. A vanity project would be something that a director or star is really passionate about, that a wider audience would probably not be as passionate about. A good example would be John Travolta's Battlefield Earth. As we all know, he is a devout Scientologist and for some reason thought a broad audience would be down for a sci-fi novel adaptation from Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard. But to call Motherless Brooklyn a vanity project would mean that a broad audience would not want to see a neo-noir about government corruption in the vein of Chinatown with a stellar cast, and that doesn't strike me as being true. As I mentioned earlier, I think Edward Norton gives a fantastic performance, but some of the critics thought he was overacting. This is just flat out wrong. I can't ever remember watching Edward Norton and thinking he was overacting, or ever thinking he was acting poorly at all. The harshness of the criticism just makes you get the suspicion that it might have something to do with Edward Norton's reputation for being arrogant and difficult. But that kind of stuff should not, of course, affect the review of a movie or a performance. And finally, many of the critics said the movie is just too long. This is the single line of criticism that just infuriates me. It's so lazy. I used to read movie criticism a lot when I was younger, and I never saw critics write this. But it seems to happen every single time there's a movie over 2 hours now. Godfather 1 and 2 are both around 3 hours. Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns are around 3 hours. Leone's masterpiece Once Upon a Time in America is 4 hours. There is no such thing as a movie that's too long. A movie is as long as it has to be. You can talk about a movie feeling slow or having slow pacing, but if a movie is done well, it's not long because you're so engaged and riveted by the film. You're not aware of the time. You're only aware of the time if the movie is dragging. So to say that a movie is long is the laziest, worst kind of film criticism there is. Edward Norton has done a fine job with writing and directing this neo-noir and gives an outstanding performance as well. If you missed out on this like I did last year, it's definitely worth taking a look at.